Va bene, ragazzi, io direi che è giunto il momento di vedere il documentario, se no ci si fa tardi. Come vi stavo dicendo, questo è il documentario sul remake di The Last of Us parte 1. È un progetto piuttosto controverso questo qua. Quando l'hanno presentato io sono stato uno di quelli che l'ha un po' criticato, nel senso che mi è sembrata tanto una manovra commerciale. Da molti punti di vista lo penso ancora, Però devo dire che dopo averlo giocato, il remake di The Last of Us parte 1, vedere quelle vicende lì con il comparto tecnico di The Last of Us parte 2 più qualcosina, devo dire che mi ha fatto effetto. Quindi ho dovuto un po' ridimensionare la mia critica, perché vuoi o non vuoi ha sortito l'effetto sperato, perlomeno su di me. E poi vabbè, c'è anche l'uscita del gioco su PC, che ovviamente è uno dei momenti in cui tanta gente l'ha potuto giocare, quindi già solo per questo, voglio dire, è una cosa che è dovuta lato PC. Però sì, è stata una mossa un po' così, e detto questo, credo che sia molto interessante vedere come l'hanno sviluppato, perché quando si tratta di progetti del genere è roba di alto livello, perciò a prescindere è una cosa interessante da vedere, ok? No, non è ufficiale di Naughty Dog, ma è un documentario di NoClip, quindi un qualcosa di piuttosto importante, ragazzi, e di collaudato nel mondo videoludico. E per la cronaca, ecco qua, si parla di NoClip, giusto? Eccolo qui il canale. Quindi mi raccomando, se ancora non siete iscritti, andatevi a iscrivere a NoClip, che fa dei documentari bellissimi, dategli supporto, c'è anche il Patreon se volete. Insomma, andate a mostrargli, diciamo, sostegno, perché stiamo per vedere un loro documentario. D'accordo? Quindi ora, bando alle ciance, spegniamo la musica di sottofondo e si parte con il documentario, che ha i sottotitoli in inglese, però quelli non automatici, tradotti in italiano, quindi la traduzione dovrebbe essere un po' più fedele del solito, anche se non perfetta, ok? Ci dobbiamo adattare a questo, d'accordo? Quindi, si parte, vai! NoClip, Remaking The Last of Us parte 1.
So, I don't know about you, but my 2023 bingo card didn't have a 10-year-old video game being the biggest pop culture hit of the year. But that's exactly what's happened to The Last of Us, thanks in no small part to the incredible success of its HBO.
Giustamente la serie TV ha contribuito assai.
Makes a lot more sense than it did. At the time there was a healthy dose of skepticism as to who
Marvel
exactly
Rivals lo
needed a
proverò.
full
Sì.
reskinning
La
of The
musica è
Last of Us
bellissima.
in the technology of its contentious sequel. It seemed like a lot of work for a game that fans appeared more than happy to boot up on the already available PS4 remaster. Well, obviously Naughty Dog were anticipating a market for new and returning players of that original game. And let's be honest, the graphical fidelity of The Last of Us Part 2 hasn't exactly helped the original in aging gracefully. In any case, this gave us an opportunity to talk to Naughty Dog about this remake, and you know we love talking about remakes on NoClip, be it Demon's Souls, Black Mesa, or a cross-country babysitting game. It's because remakes are the rare opportunity where we, the player, are familiar with both the end product and the source material, in this case, the original PS3 version. It allows us to get an understanding of how design decisions were made as we compare and contrast where they started and where they ended up.
Che figo sto modello.
So last month we traveled down to Naughty Dog in Santa Monica to talk to a handful of the project leads about the work that went into creating The Last of Us Part 1, how they rebuilt levels from the ground up in the new engine, how they utilized modern lighting and animation tech to modernize Joel and Ellie, the work that went into making sure AI and gameplay felt in tune with the original, and honestly a bunch of design challenges.
Le parti di shooting le odio sempre un po' in The Last of Us, perché sono orbo a mirare col controller.
We're gonna keep this as spoiler free as humanly possible and only show gameplay from the first opening third of that first game. We're going to talk about a lot though, from AI to art, from game design to graphics, sound, and much, much more. But to start, let's go back to the beginning and ask, why did this project get greenlit in the first place, and how did the team initially approach it?
Prima del 3 devono fare la remaster del remake. Cazzo, spero di no. In compenso si vocifera che lo faranno per Horizon.
For the last year or so development on the original Last of Us, and that was an incredible experience. getting to work with Bruce Straley and Neil back in the day, and this just unbelievable team of just like super talented designers that I just, was wanting to copy everything they were doing and learn everything they were doing, and it was extremely collaborative.
Questa era PlayStation 3,
everyone's input was valued. It wasn't like you worked on something and then your lead reviewed it and you worked on it again. It was like you were expected to hand the controller to other people, get them to play
gran bella domanda.
Get wide opinions, get opinions from people who maybe weren't in the design department and weren't even like playing the game day to day and had very little familiarity with it, very little previous assumptions. One of the other benefits of kind of working in Naughty Dog style is just like there's always this very strong high-level creative direction. That was something that I've long appreciated working here, and I tried to emulate stepping into this role, was that there was always this just like central vision of like, this is what the game is. This is The Last of Us. It's grounded, it's intimate, it's human scale. It's about, the humanity of the enemies. It's about the humanity of the infected. Just having those high-level creative vision to
spin-off
always
su
check back
Joel,
what,
si vocifera
I'm working on combat,
spin-off
gameplay
su
systems,
Tommy.
that kind of thing. That's not the story, but it is. It's everything we're doing is in service of telling that story, creating that experience, and just that very strong direction coming from Neil and Bruce was useful kind of for everyone working on the game, because they could always check back on that. And it was like something we were all building together and working towards together. It's funny to get to revisit so many of those moments, with a decade of hindsight and how far all our technology and our tools have progressed.
It's like the ultimate patch.
Exactly. The 10-year later patch.
Yeah.
The starting point for it was making the flashbacks in The Last of Us
sei emo?
Part 2,
Non sono troppo vecchio per essere emo.
Alongside,
Mi vestivo così quando ancora gli emo non esistevano.
It really sparked this inspiration for the studio of just like, what if we could make the whole game look like that? What if we could make The Last of Us look like these flashbacks that we've kind of faked to be contiguous to Last of Us Part 2, and that overall it was a very appealing idea of just like have The Last of Us and make it so that if you wanted to play both games back to back, you weren't like playing a PS3 game and then playing a PS5 game. Like, yes, there was the remaster on the PS4, but that remaster really was a remaster scale project. It's going in and, upgrading the engine and taking all the tweakable numbers and maxing those all out as far as we can in the new hardware, but it's not really going back in and like fundamentally remaking assets, integrating our latest technology. It's more of almost like a tech art exercise. If you were someone who wanted to get started with the series, with The Last of Us series,
la scena dell'astronauta è veramente figo.
2023, you'd be getting this really
stile è goth
in graphical fidelity across the generations.
Stile gotico.
But there also was a bunch of other
esiste agli anni
80 things that we wanted to do for The Last of Us.
Più o meno, anche prima, a dire la verità.
Doing like UX testing on our games and finding how are we tutorializing mechanics, how are we onboarding players onto the game, how are we doing like resource balancing to maintain kind of a appropriate level of starvation for kind of this post-apocalyptic world. The Last of Us was kind of the last game we made before even Uncharted 4, which was like our big push starting into accessibility, and it had a one-page accessibility menu. To then get to The Last of Us Part 2, we have 60+ accessibility options. We really opened up the game to players who are blind or deaf or have a physical or motor disability. So there was kind of across the board just a lot of really compelling reasons to want to do this and to want to make, the best version of this game.
La super accessibilità per tutti i giocatori anche con disabilità, questa è vera inclusività. Stile malnato.
I remember the conversations in the studio was, wow, wouldn't it be amazing if we could, play part 1 and part 2 back to back. Have really like people play and follow Ellie and Joel's journey sort of contiguously across both games. But we had this fidelity gap. The first game was made almost 10 years ago. We sat down and we said, well, okay, what could we pillage, so to speak, from part 2? What we loved about combat and AI and what we would use and what we wouldn't use. So we had Sebastian and Eric, our art directors, sort of look at the entire game across all the different levels and sort of make an assessment of improvements, like what were continuity breaks that we had in the original game that we could now address? How do we accentuate certain spaces, right? So just small ways of punctuating spaces that, you know, using lighting, using art direction, environmental storytelling, and all the different tools we had to celebrate certain aspects of the game and even double down in certain areas. I'll give you an example. We had the quarantine zone.
Amici
Inside
gotici?
of that
Sì,
space,
alcuni.
it's supposed to feel pretty
Luigi.
populated, but, you know, low in resources and pretty stark and heavy. And when we first started arting that space, we were like, oh man, we could make, you know, from an art direction perspective or from, you know, beautification perspective, we could make this place really pretty. We could add, you know, some silhouettes here with trees and vines and bushes and start to shape the space a certain way. But what happened was that we started to realize really quickly that we're actually changing the tone of this space really quickly. The whole point of the quarantine zone was that it was barren and stark and almost oppressive, but safe in comparison to outside of the quarantine walls, which was beautiful and lush and overgrown, but dangerous, right? So those are some of the things that we kept having to constantly question ourselves. Are we adding for the sake of beautification, or are we actually celebrating the story and the core of that story? We weren't evolving it so that the narrative of those spaces changed drastically.
The levels, the storytelling, those were all really great. What felt dated was maybe the art. A lot of this, what we were trying to do was stay in service of the original art direction in a sense. But if you picture like, oh, okay, this is a street in Pittsburgh that has been flooded and overgrown with, you know, 20 years of vegetation, that means one thing when you're making it to PS3 standards. But nowadays, we can execute that very same idea, that same vision, the same intent. But oh no, there would be way more
motion capture
lush
così,
green,
visto un gioco
there
di
would be,
Red Dead 2.
insects
Allora,
skimming the
da
top
certi
of the
punti
water
di
and
vista
leaving
sì,
ripples
però
where they
ora
land.
c'è il
Everything
Blade
would be
2.
swaying in the breeze because it's this lush organic environment. Just things that weren't possible on the PlayStation 3.
Il che è anche normale perché sono comunque passati un po' di anni.
When we hear the term remaster or remake, we immediately assume that at the very least the game is going to get
Oh
a fresh
Cristo,
coat
sta
of
parte
paint.
qua, me la ricordo
Thankfully
bene.
for The Last of Us Part 1, the team had a clear and obvious benchmark, the recently released sequel.
The only problem is that modern game worlds require a lot of people power to populate with 4K assets. And while modern lighting and more detailed areas had the power to bring these levels to life, the team had to be careful of changing so much that the original design intent of those spaces was lost.
Perché hanno rifatto davvero tutto, nel senso gli asset sono rifatti da zero, anche se ovviamente molte cose hanno cercato di rifarle uno a
Typically what it
uno.
would involve
Però non
is,
tutte.
The environment artist like taking the
No,
original
cioè sono
game's
tutte rifatte,
geometry, opening
non
it in
tutte a
Maya,
uno a
and
uno.
creating
Però molte
brand
sì.
new buildings essentially, or applying, you know, new textures to existing geometry, but just like building something on the footprint of what used to be there, and not following it, you know, 100% one-to-one, but the big shapes, the layout of the level in terms of, you know, where are the openings and closings, the floors and stuff like that, and then going in and adding just a ton more detail to every
Il fuoco a 30 fps, qui non ci ho fatto caso, ma durante il gioco mi pare di averle notate un paio di queste
and then
cose.
going in and adding the details of the, you know, the VFX, the lighting, rather than following the footprint one-to-one, adding the destruction, adding the wear and tear, taking a corner of the world that was pretty nondescript and adding a theme, making it more resonant with what you'd find on a street or in a building or in this particular corner of the world. On the PS3, we often had to make very intentional choices about like where to put detail, kind of along the golden critical path, and then a lot of the kind of side corners could be a lot less detail, just because that's what you could afford in memory at the time.
Minchia, su PS3 immagino che casino deve essere
Who's
stato.
going to check out every inch of the layout, not just on the golden path. Find little bits of environmental storytelling, little bits of detail, little bits of life and nature. No matter where they go, if they really want to just look in every nook and cranny of the space, they're going to find, you know, that someone at Naughty Dog or PlayStation Visual Arts has gone in and really sweat those details and really put in all that detail into the world.
There's our culprit.
Everything had to be redone. Everything had to be remade from scratch, especially the shaders. All of them had to be reauthored. Because of the resolution that you can afford, all of the old assets will not stand up to the resolution. But in terms of curation of the space, you have to have restraint so that you don't clutter up the place. You have to always think about the narrative of the space. Like, what is the story that's in the space? How can you make it with the least amount of elements?
Sì, no, su PS3 era qualcosa di sconvolgente questo gioco.
And you have to give the player that rest.
Non so se qualcos'altro gli tiene testa su PS3.
Process the details. It's very important to us to restrain our textures, our palettes, how much detail we put that might take you out of your focus. It might call too much attention to itself. So every time we go into a space, we try to tell one story and we try not to layer too much. So we try to focus on what that story is and we build
Pinta al massimo come parte 2 su PS4 è abbastanza, sì. Però poi su PS4 sono usciti anche God of War, Spider-Man, Horizon, quindi diciamo che The Last of Us è superiore secondo me da molti punti di vista, però giochi molto ambiziosi ci sono stati. Perché i sviluppatori hanno sempre detto l'hardware di PS3 è stato un inferno per lo sviluppo dei giochi. Per carità, saranno stati sicuramente, è stata comunque una console molto importante.
What did this place used to be? What's happened in the 20 years and how are you finding it now? There's a part of the game where you go through the Boston State House Museum and there's these back rooms, kind of offices, and in the original game, that's what they were. They're kind of like generic backroom offices. And we were looking at that and going, well, you're going through a museum. What could this space be? What would they have in the back rooms of a museum? We have now more memory, budget, production time on this game to go in and reconcept that and to think about that and go, oh, actually, well, maybe in the back rooms of this museum, there would be an art restoration station. Or maybe they'd have a bunch of colonial busts, in the closet, in storage, waiting for their next exhibit or stuff like that. And all across the game,
sta cosa, sì. Clicker
really
de merda.
Down on the environmental storytelling. The art upgrade is
Maledetto.
also a
Quanto li ho odiati.
in a sense.
Gli Stalker però più di tutti probabilmente, che poi non sono nell'1. Oh no, aspetta, ci sono gli Stalker nell'1?
With an older generation
Non mi
of
ricordo.
art style, there was a certain simplicity that gave some clarity, right? If just overall the scene was less detailed, it also meant it was less noisy, and that you could easily tell your path through the level, look for your goal, that sort of thing. And that was something that we really didn't want to lose as we moved into this next-gen upgrade. It was like, okay, you still need to be able to blur your eyes and tell where
la
the goal
IA
is.
di The Last of Us è uno cioè delle cose che proprio
as you said,
ha sorpreso più di tutte.
While still passing the kind of
è veramente fantastica.
Of just being able to, you can navigate through the space, you can see where your goal is. It's very clear what you can climb on, what you can't climb on. Our get out of jail free card is always putting vegetation on things.
Io non ricordo gli Stalker nemmeno. Sai che nemmeno io, però mi dicono di sì.
Too slippery. Yes, exactly.
Wait here.
We actually use foliage for gameplay reasons as an artistic language of like where you can't go. We use foliage to communicate that this area,
le siepone che ti fanno capire no, qui è chiuso.
Can't be climbed on. So we use foliage
Quando sei con Sam nelle fogne, ad esempio, ci sono gli Stalker.
Outside than just looking good. If there's
sto cercando di ricordarmi il punto esatto.
We put foliage over it to give that
non mi sta venendo in mente.
Rest in the scene. So it's a compositional tool as well. Sky's another thing too. We try to curate that so that it's not too busy.
Ci sto
it's
pensando.
Only interesting in certain areas. Foliage is our vertical tool to clean up, like let's say the brick or the noisy rusting or the
la
metals.
scuola.
That's just giving too
E il
much
primo bloater.
attention.
Madonna, la prima volta.
Our vertical tool for that. And grass is
Su
our
PS4
horizontal tool, and obviously the sky.
facevo ancora più cagare a mirare e il pad era inferiore onestamente.
Even given the constraints of, it has to be grounded, it has to be
Bloater mi ha
natural, there's
massacrato
no
la prima
artificial
volta.
light sources. The amount of attention that our lighting artists go in, like they're painting in the cloud shadows to be very strategically like, oh, that hot spot is drawing attention. I'm going to paint a cloud shadow over it so that it doesn't draw attention, so that instead you're focusing on what you're supposed to be looking at.
I think the interesting thing is it's the places where we didn't light was the biggest jump in technology, because in the PlayStation 3, we couldn't have areas go to dark. We couldn't have areas go to complete darkness because you can't see anything, therefore you can't play anything. So it was a conscious decision to
che
raise
odio
up
quando
the
ti arrivano dal
ambient light so
nulla.
that you can actually see things, but it also took you out of that realism, because if you're in a room with no lighting, it will be dark, right?
Eccolo va.
But in the new game, since we have more tech, we can afford more, and we have better shaders, we're able to use techniques now where we can sort of like use atmosphere, some of these hood lighting to like just simulate what would it feel like when your eyes adjust to the dark. And then you can see things at a certain radius to give you like an idea of where things are at, but then it falls
Nella
off
zona quando cade l'ascensore
drastically
ti
into
via il generatore, ci sono dei
So,
stalker.
I think
Davvero, non lo
that
so,
was
c'è un
one
po'
of
di vuoto di
the
memoria
biggest jumps
da
that we've had,
questo punto di
where
vista.
Now the game feels real, because now if you're in the darkness, you really feel that you're alone. You're in this very intense moment.
I was too damn close.
We try to add a lot of movement as much as possible to just give life to the scene, because the player obviously can just stop anywhere. So whether it's like adding rats or a squirrel or bugs, we try to add that and try to add like movements in the trees or the leaves. Yeah, I mean, it's more of like what we can afford. It's like Kurosawa's thing, like the picture has to always be moving, right? There's to give life to the screen, whether it's wind or smoke or blades of grass. We tune all of that so that it has that feeling of groundedness, so that you're just not looking at a painting.
It's lighting, yes, and it's
Questa è
lighting tech,
interessante
yes,
come
but
cosa.
it's everything playing in concert to sort of create this experience or intensify this experience. And if you compare it to the original game, you just didn't have such, you couldn't go as deep just because we didn't have all of these things, you know, firing on all cylinders.
Come vi ho detto durante l'introduzione, lì per lì non pensavo che rigiocandolo avrei percepito tutto questo stacco, ma invece mi è successo. Da Ferdian, buonasera. Un documentario sul remake di The Last of Us 1. Bisogna rigiocarlo, ho già dato. Ho giocato entrambi 2 volte praticamente.
Tess, Bill and Ellie acted without fundamentally changing how The Last of Us played.
Oh, l'intelligenza
One of the great
artificiale.
things about making The Last of Us Part 1 was that we got to start from the starting point of the AI we had developed for The Last of Us Part 2.
Esatto.
Which was, 8 or 9 years of tech improvements all rolled into our latest and greatest AI.
Già.
In The Last of Us Part 2, those AI are much more capable of just like acting in clever ways in a space. To maybe give a contrast, starting point of the original game, in the original game, for one, we could only have 8 NPCs alive at a time. So it's kind of a smoke and mirrors thing, but as you're playing the game, we're constantly, if you move through the space in certain ways, having to unload enemies behind you, load in enemies in front of you. If you backtrack, do the opposite. We do some smoke and mirrors to make the spaces feel more populated than they actually are. That wasn't a limitation that we had to respect on the PS5. We could have more NPCs alive at the same time. Though truthfully, sometimes we did use that same
Quando ci sono tanti nemici e ti mettono a giro è il momento veramente frustrante, perché il gioco è troppo pesante per farti reagire velocemente.
The AI that we've developed in the years since is much better at reacting to how the player moves. So in the original game, let's say you were pushing up through a space and you were kind of taking a right corridor through a space. The technology that we had back then basically meant that the combat scripter had to go in and say, oh, the player's going this way, well, I'll assign one NPC to flank them this way, I'll assign one NPC to hold this point. You need a lot of hand scripting to kind of react to what the player was doing, because the AI didn't have this like larger sense of like spatial analysis and that sort of thing. Some of the technology we've developed in the years since is to be able to be a lot less didactic about like exactly what the AI is going to do. Instead, what you're putting into the space is like, okay, this is a strong position to hold, and this is a strong position to hold, but whether or not you use those positions is like kind of be up to the player's position, the NPC's position, the coordination between NPCs,
sarebbe in modalità storia? Non ti vergogni, scherzo? No, neanche un po'.
Sì. Overall,
lo faccio quando non mi piace il sistema di combattimento.
Encounter 10 different ways, the AI should react in 10 different ways. it should really pick angles that you weren't expecting. We can do much more sophisticated analysis of, like, we have this exposure map and being able to, like, do path cost functions.
No, io non vedo l'ora di dimenticarmi il primo e il secondo flow, così me li rigioco. Magari fosse così semplice.
We have this concept of future exposure, where they can say, okay, in 2 seconds, this NPC is moving
Quello
this
sì
way,
che è un gioco che vorrei rimuovere tutto dalla mia mente per rigiocarli, sì.
And get hidden from that.
Ha fatto la stessa cosa mia. Pistola, vaffanculo, non muore, bam, fucilata.
That we developed for The Last of Us Part 2 that was so far beyond what we'd done on previous games. Because, like, effectively the way that the buddy AI works is the buddy is constantly testing all the different positions around the player, all the different positions that they could be hanging out, and thinking, well, what score should I give to each one? You know, there's different parameters. This one's on screen, so that's good, so I'll be visible to the player. But this one's kind of in danger. That one's kind of far from the player. And being able to balance all those different considerations and be able to make intelligent choices, all that benefits tremendously from more advanced hardware, because you can just do more and more tests, more and more sophisticated logic, to, in the end, create this buddy that just feels like a real person.
Momenti con clicker al buio.
It doesn't matter if your buddy mathematically picked the best position possible and you could prove it that this position was the right one to go to. It's, do they feel like a real person? Because if they feel like a real person, then you're going on a journey with them. And all the tech and the gameplay and whatever just washes away, and you're just there in this moment with Ellie, with Bill, with Sam, with whoever.
Okay.
And you're
Ho capito che cosa vuole dire, è interessante.
Kind of fear and tension of this moment that they're having.
Se trovo un modo per dimenticarli, fammelo sapere, così lo uso anch'io.
But the intent is to just lose you in the story.
I see him.
C'è chi millanta di aver inventato una macchina per l'elettroshock in grado di rimuovere specifici ricordi. Non so se è degno di fiducia particolarmente, perché nello stesso posto ha parlato anche della terra piatta e del complotto giudeo-massonico. Non mi sembra degno del tutto di fiducia.
You know, I kind of mentioned just if we had just taken, okay, we have our latest AI, latest technology.
Ho dato il primo, quello che so. Il secondo mi frega molto a giocarlo in termini di cruda violenza e pugni emotivi nello stomaco. Non mi sento di dire no dai, giocalo lo stesso allora. Perché lo è. Per cruda violenza e pugni emotivi proprio non mancano.
It would have made it just this completely different encounter that was like a forced stealth segment. So it was a funny.
È l'invisibile nemici, sì, è vero, però quello l'ho sempre ritenuto un qualcosa necessario per il gameplay, perché scusate se faccio un attimo la pausa, no? Questa cosa merita di essere considerata. Multiplayer Ricky, salve. Il fatto che Ellie sia invisibile ai nemici è chiaramente una cosa fatta a vantaggio del gameplay e della pace mentale del giocatore, perché provate a immaginare una cosa: se indipendentemente dalla vostra volontà i nemici vedono Ellie e voi avete passato 15 minuti a cercare di fare il possibile per non essere visti, e improvvisamente Ellie sbrocca, se ne va a fare un giro e viene vista da 6 nemici. Cioè, non vi viene voglia di disinstallare, no, il gioco, la vita in quel momento? Ecco, quindi temo che sia una soluzione proprio prettamente pratica e impossibile da evitare.
Helped gate how much tension or how much heat you got if you broke stealth, and it made it feel more like this encounter that we really loved from the original game. This fight that had a good balance of trying to get you
Cristo, credo non sia fiduciosa come cosa.
You had to do a fight, but you weren't just overwhelmed. We didn't want to make something, you know, that felt completely different from that. We really wanted to just honor what was there, but make it the best version of itself. Just about every developer who worked on The Last of Us Part 1 was running the original game like on a second screen or something.
Prima della sua fase molto bella con Joel, non mi è piaciuto la ragazza calcia come Ellie, sembra Terminator, molto meglio Abby, più credibile, più muscolosa, però è un gioco che ci sta. Anche io sono team Abby.
Melee move, this experience of aiming this gun, how does it hold up? Is it different in a good way? Have we lost something? It was always important to have that touchstone of just like, we want this to be a really great version of the original game, but we don't want it to stray into something completely different or to lose some essential essence of what was really, really terrific about the original game.
The project started with Naughty Dog remaking
Il livello di
cutscene
profondità di
flashbacks
valutazione
from the
dei singoli
original game in
aspetti
The
che ha
Last of
Naughty
Us
Dog
Part
è
2, so they
veramente
already knew how much work was needed to
notevole.
remake
Vabbè,
them all in a
non
new
è un
engine.
caso.
First of all, cutscenes in the originals were pre-rendered, often using different lighting setups and not always color matching with the action in the game.
È
There were
vero.
also gameplay implications because of the way these cutscenes were implemented.
We're going to talk about character performance and cutscenes in just a moment, but before we do that, I want to highlight an oft-forgotten strength of Naughty Dog games: sound design.
While the team had free reign to
Disinstallare la
introduce new
vita,
audio to
serio.
areas like emitters in
Io
the
infatti
game
prefiero
world,
tanto non
they were
scappa.
very limited in what
Quando
they
ti
could
vai è
do
lì.
regarding elements like character dialogue and music.
Once upon a time, I had somebody that I cared about.
Our whole goal at Naughty Dog has been coverage, is to get coverage. So it was really like anything that can make a sound should have a sound. And so we did our best at the time. There were a lot of things that we just weren't able to get done, at the time. But realism in sound is actually very difficult to recreate faithfully, because when you do it incorrectly, it's immediately noticeable. When there's, when you're working on a big game that involves magic or, sort of hyper-realism in a really substantial way, it's easy to hide behind, big sound. But when nothing about the sound is big, when it's all very small and very detailed, you really dial into those details.
No, sopporto Abby. Ci sta, è stata sul cazzo a tantissime persone. Io sono uno di quelli che invece l'ha
In some
apprezzata
ways, it's
molto.
easier to create things from scratch. This, we were using some old systems that we had on the original game, and we were bringing in new systems
Bella
from
parte di
Last
Bill,
Part
sì.
2. So in that sense, it was a little bit of a technological Frankenstein. The original
Madonna,
game
ci
was built
sono
on an engine that effectively doesn't exist anymore.
certi
We had made
angoletti
decisions
di questo
early that
gioco
we weren't going to re-record the
che
actors.
sono
It was
davvero
too difficult to try to age
proprio
match them, EQ
terribili, ti
match
strappano
them,
il cuore.
like it would just open up a can of worms. It would show itself. It would show the seams. So we actually end up remastering some of the main English dialogue. And we said, okay, this is how people played the original game, and we don't really want to fundamentally change that. For ambiences, we actually used a lot of material from Last of Us Part 2. And so we didn't have to record anything new so much. We did have new systems that we pulled in from Last of Us Part 2, which are far more robust than they were. But we were using the Foley system, from Last of Us Part 2. So we needed to be able to pull that over. Then Foley, meaning cloth and footsteps, things like that. Weapons,
quindi molti asset audio da Last of Us Parte 2, ma tecnologia completamente diversa.
Right. Our goal was to get the game stood up and at least sound like the original game, and then if we had time to really be able to flesh it out. Now, in terms of ambience,
Team Abby tutta la vita, da un personaggio che ho odiato profondamente e poi amato ancora di più. Incredibile, mi ha fatto cambiare idea, soprattutto per avere certe cose per un personaggio come Abby. Stessa identica cosa.
Listen to the game when I played it again on the PS4, I forgot.
Terzo capitolo siano in grado di redimere Ellie. Chi lo sa, ragazzi, non so proprio cosa immaginarmi per il terzo capitolo, proprio non lo so. La odio perché è fatta bene, proprio come carattere, non lo sopporto. Vabbè, ci sta. Ci sta. Assolutamente.
You can really hear it, like in Outskirts in the Rain and in Billstown. The ambiences are much more thoroughly populated, and it's much more 3D experience. Birds and water all over the place, and I think did I say insects? All the little things that we populate our worlds with. There's a significant difference between the music of The Last of Us Part 1 and The Last of Us Part 2. Part 1 is much more atmospheric, the orchestration is much more open, and it's used only at really key touch points, relatively speaking. In Part 2, there's much greater coverage. In the first game, however, it was really, I think, to create a sense of the openness of the world and the deadness of the world. And then when it does come in, it really has the effect of pulling on your heartstrings. I can think of, at least a dozen places
showcase di Sony, intendo come vera bomba, magari anche non annunciata.
The lack of music.
La nuova IP di Naughty Dog.
Preceding a moment that then is touched by music really amplifies that. There's a saying in traditional orchestration that certain instrument groups are effective inversely proportional to their use. And I think that The Last of Us Part 1 is a really good example of that over the course of a whole game. That music was used less, but when it was used, it was very, very impactful.
Terzo capitolo ci sarà veramente, volete, si stanno focalizzando sulla 9P, sono vere... Aiuto, sono vere entrambe le cose. Probabilmente uscirà prima la nuova IP, e poi magari a fine generazione parte 3.
Thanks for the heroics and all. Ellie. Hey, what are you... Joel?
Bill!
What are you doing?
Bill!
Let me go.
Turn around and get on your knees.
Just calm down a second.
Turn around
All right.
and get on your knees. Don't test me. Just...
Cutscenes have evolved. And I think a lot of
Bill
people
un po'...
don't have a full sense of how much they have evolved.
Un po' paranoico.
Going back into sequences where, for example, we had transition issues, right? Like before we were limited by tech. We'd have to slam to black and load the level underneath it. So there were certain restrictions we had there. We had different depth of field tech, so or lack of, right? So we couldn't sort of play.
Questo mi ha fatto davvero effetto, cioè, questo, guarda, fermo un attimo, sono davvero delle cose che tu te le immagini, nel senso, certo che avranno rinnovato tutte queste cose, certo che sarà tutto con più profondità, certo che la luce sarà migliore, le texture migliori, l'audio migliore, certo che sarà tutto migliore, ma poi con un gioco del genere te lo vedi davanti agli occhi, devo dire che nonostante già l'avessi giocato, già conoscessi le vicende, porca miseria, mi ha fatto effetto. Mi sono dovuto rimangiare quello che pensavo. Però un po' lo penso ancora.
Perspectives or feel of a shot, just simple things like that was a little more difficult or challenging at the time.
God damn it!
So we went back in and sort of re-looked at scenes completely. New cameras, new cinematography, new lens choices. Even when we are shaving sort of the timing cuts, we have a bunch of limitations too, right? Like we didn't want to reinvent everything. So we were staying within a certain sort of parameter. We were cutting and shaving, making scenes longer, some shots shorter, depending on what we needed. So a lot of the storytelling sort of evolved sort of organically when looking at the scenes. If you compare them side by side, that's when you really see the differences. And a lot of it is just trying to keep the integrity of the story together.
Talking about the
dovessi fare una classica, quale sarebbe? Oddio, che intendi con una classica?
That removing those kind of black frames between pre-rendered cutscenes and then in-engine gameplay was that, yeah, there were a lot of transitions, that a few that we could make seamless, going seamlessly from gameplay into cinematic or gameplay into animation. And then there were others that all of a sudden needed a transition. So if you saw a cinematic and the very last thing that happens in the cinematic is kind of Henry walking off out of frame.
Interessante sta cosa.
In the gameplay again, if Henry's standing still, that doesn't match. Like it destroys your sense of like continuity. So now all of a sudden we had to sweat, okay, well, at the very end of the cinematic, Joel was walking, Henry was walking. They both need to be walking like on the cut back into gameplay. But otherwise, you know, the black frame was more forgiving about that little break in between the cutscene and the gameplay. Now we had to honor those transitions in and out. You know, that's one of the things that feels the most dated when you go back and play the old games is these,
che uno non ci pensa, ma se elimini i tagli e poi i personaggi devi considerare che cosa diavolo stanno facendo in quel momento.
Yeah, you put the controller down, you're watching a movie. Now it feels much more of the whole kind of same cloth.
We had issues in the past with, you know, cutscene lighting was pre-rendered and it was a bit more curated than what we could have supported in game. But now with PS5, we were able to actually match those and not have pre-rendered, have real-time cutscenes. And then we could cross from cutscene into gameplay, into IGC back into cutscene almost seamlessly using the same lighting setup. And now that those gates were open, we could actually shape the gameplay in ways we couldn't, in much more detail, to say, tell the player where to go without
multiplayer di The Last of Us,
right? Like, gently pull you along.
Magari uscirà Jason Schreier con un mega resoconto o qualche canale come questo col documentario un giorno. Magari, sono curioso anch'io.
But the cinematic looked better if it went the other way. So now that we made it the same, we had to like deal with that inconsistency in how we would place it in that world, because all of the cutscenes were done separately in a different file. They weren't necessarily sitting in actual space in the level. So it posed a lot of challenges back then because that wasn't planned for.
Ricky, ciao.
We never intended it to be seamless. But that one is a little easier to
Colpa
cheat
di
in a way
Bungie,
because
beh,
players don't
immagino
pay
che
that
non
much
sia solo
attention
quello.
to it. The hard ones were where the room didn't even exist in the level, and they have to like come out from a closet somewhere, and then they can't go back to that room because it's a different room.
So you have the original game, and it's the holy grail of games for us at the studio and for the community, right, and our fans. So anytime we go back to certain key scenes, I personally am filled with anticipation that when we go back to revisit these sequences, we spend a lot of time in this creative soup thinking, did we actually make this better? Is this actually different? And there's a lot of conversations about that and a lot of fear that we're actually sometimes taking away from a scene. So, you know, that can happen a lot in the process. And we go back and forth. Like there was this space where, you know, Joel wakes up 20 years later, Tess is at the door, and he's walking towards the door, and we kind of see his space. And again, the inclination is to like, oh, let's put canned foods and let's put all the stuff he's hoarded in this space. And we went down that road, and it looked beautiful. And then, you know, we had to go back. I'm like, no, this space is, you know, food is scarce here. Like, you can't have that much canned food. And, you know, the artist was like, yeah, but it doesn't look good. So we're always in a constant tug of war in the team on what is too far in one direction that actually changes the actual feel of the space, and then what actually helps and punctuates the particular feel of the space.
One of the biggest changes is the look of Tess. In the new version,
Inizialmente Ellie con le sembianze alle Page, non so se fosse ripresa da lei, magari ispirata, non saprei.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of our characters were rebuilt from scratch. Every character is rebuilt. And it's...
Tess mi piaceva più prima.
It's funny because, you know, she was always meant to look that way, at least in our mind's eye, right? Again, the tech and the artistic development just wasn't there yet. So when we had the opportunity to revisit those characters and rebuild them, we literally went back to the drawing board, the original concepts, and said, okay, let's better realize these characters. And that's what you're witnessing when you see Tess evolve and old Joel evolved and even Ellie evolved, is us taking these characters, adding sort of the grounding factors to them so that they feel real, that there's blood underneath their skin, and, you know, they get flushed when they get angry, and, you know, even all the subtle nuances in the facial animation. You know, we were meticulous about trying to, you know, even go back to some of the original performances. Like, we went back to the original footage of these actors, and the animation team did an incredible job, so shout out to the animation team. But they really went back there and tried to capture now that we had all this new facial rigs and facial features and the models and characters, which the character team did an incredible job as well, we could actually capture some of the nuances. These little subtle sort of interactions that, you know, you feel when you talk to a real person. We didn't have the tech at the time on the original game to actually capture that. So what you're seeing or witnessing is sort of that evolution of the merging of a decade of technology and a decade of artistic development.
Io mi ero innamorata di Tessa, poi è finita male. I particellari sono da migliorare. Aveva voglia.
Make this easy for me.
Joel in particular had disproportionately large eyes in the first game. And I think that was made because we wanted him to be more expressive and to be more visible in terms of where you see him. And it's probably also related to our tech back then, where we couldn't like have enough control in their face. We made the eyes more expressive in the past. But in the new game, we made it more realistic. The proportions are now real. We've constructed the eyeball to be very detailed into seeing into the retina. And so when you create these characters,
paragonato al capolavoro di The Day Before,
we want them to relate, to be relatable. We want them to be believable. And we wanted something that's more grounded, even though we can add all of these detail. We wanted to build in imperfections and stuff so that they feel like they've been through a lot and aging as well. We can afford more hair now, so like if you zoom in, you can see hair in the skin. We have better control of our rigs now, and we have more resolution. in the face, so we can capture the nuances of the performance by their talent.
Joel, I can handle myself.
No. Just stay here.
It's fine. Just wait around for you two to get me killed.
A lot
Sì, sta
of
cosa degli
care
occhi
and time
sproporzionati mi ha
went
lasciato un
into
po' così.
creating these micro expressions and getting these little nuanced movements, these hesitations, like these characters that feel like they're thinking thoughts and actually, contemplating stuff in the background outside of what they speak. Those things are very meticulously animated by an exceptional team. We were starting from a pretty strong foundation. And then the team really
uno
went
dei
in
punti di forza
and got,
questo.
like every little detail. And a big part of that is studying that reference footage and really looking at, like, again, micro moves. Like we have like facial cam references that we shot, like, say, the original game on, that we had to pull out of the archives and really go through. But did they actually make this expression, or did we add that expression in there? And then we went in and it was like, no, this is where the original intent of this performance was. Can we get that back?
Oh, look at that.
Would you play this before?
No. But I had a friend that knew everything about this game.
In the intervening years, we've developed this system for systemic emotions. So, the character is just in systemic AI doing something in the space or whatever they're doing. We kind of have this bucket of like facial idle animations that they can be doing, like kind of happy, kind of sad, kind of scared. Being able to apply those for the downbeats, kind of the exploration beats, was really, really big. And especially for
minchia, che
the kind of
casino.
on the stick.
Io la cosa controcorrente di film non ti tocca, sapete, non mi senti volere un terzo capitolo? Dato che la serie è finita, con un finale aperto, non so, mi fa pensare proprio quello bello e finale. Speriamo. È uno dei motivi per cui non so che cosa aspettarmi dal 3.
Watch her face,
davvero non lo so.
Because it will change sometimes on
So
every
solo che lo
line.
voglio, però.
So they'll deliver one line and be kind of happy,
Sono
and
troppo
deliver one
curioso.
line can be kind of pouty. We have such better tools for buddies.
In parte ho adorato letteralmente l'espressione fa sì combattimento, sardinare veramente, vero anche quello, sì.
Part one and put the controller down and watch what Ellie does. She'll be walking around the space, kind of looking around, checking things out, looking at vistas, looking under tables. One of the things that I feel like The Last of Us was actually quite groundbreaking, and even back in the day, was thinking about storytelling in games and saying, like, this is not a story that's being told in the cinematics, and then you play some gameplay to unlock the next cinematic. It's like the story of Ellie and Joel is the whole thing is the story. What you're doing in the gameplay is creating the tension that then pays off in the cinematic. And then what you're doing in the cinematic is setting up the objective that will then motivate the next section of gameplay. And that story moment that just happened in that cinematic is paying off an offhand comment that a character made 10 minutes ago while you were walking ambiently through a space or was preceded in some way. Like every part of this game is telling the story. Previous gens we had Rumble in the controllers, but Rumble is
spero che non allunghi il bordo, ma lo spero anch'io perché c'è troppa attenzione per questo franchise, tantissima.
And stuff like that. But it really is most appropriate for giving kind of coarse-grained feedback, gunshots, explosions, stuff like that. With the DualSense, it's much higher resolution and it lets us do very fine details. So we could do haptic vibrations on, the weather, the rain.
You're petting the giraffe and you can feel the hand shudder as it goes down the fur and you feel it vibrate, and I'm like, whoa, right? Like, it's just mind-blowing. And then that leads to now, okay, well, can we put that in the cutscenes? Can we have when Joel adjusts the watch that Sarah gives him, can that also vibrate? And it can.
And similarly for the adaptive triggers, we can provide different levels of resistance on the triggers based on what action you're doing, what gun you're using. This is especially useful in combat because we can make, the high caliber power weapons feel more weighty, they take a little more pressure to aim, they take a little more pressure to fire versus like a pistol we can make.
Belli in coda.
In Left Behind, there's a sequence
quello sono io che
where
tento di mirare.
Do a water gun fight. When you're reloading, when you're pumping the water gun, the amount of resistance on the trigger is variable based on like how much pressure is building up in the tank. As designers, we love anything that we can like give a little more expressiveness, a little more detail, really honor what's happening on the screen, and this was just another great way to be able to do that.
Sono quelle piccole cosette che però fanno anche la grandezza della profondità del gioco. Oh, questa parte, madonna. È proprio l'inizio. Pensa a quelli che l'hanno visto per la prima volta su
Reviewing it was
PS3.
very important, and like trying to compare it side by side with the original.
E io non sono
on
tra
almost every
questi,
frame
oltretutto.
was
Ho giocato per la prima
critical
volta la
to make
versione
sure that
rimasterizzata
we are
per
always
PS4.
hitting that narrative or that art direction note that was made in the original, and it survives that translation. With 10 years of hindsight, there is a huge temptation to just change it. And that's a very dangerous way of thinking, because you have to honor what other people like about it. And a lot of people are very attached to those memories. We can't be too selfish into like putting our vision in it. It has to be something that we have to respect what the original team did, and we're just passing on that gift, I'd say. But there was a lot of like things that we did tweak, but it was all for just strengthening that same narrative. And you realize and you're humbled by how good it actually was, even at its time, and how it's the art direction of the original game survived even in this remake. And we're like slowly going back and saying like, oh yeah, those guys.
È la versione fisica PS3 addirittura? Beh, addirittura, immagino sia molto diffusa in effetti. Okay.
Thanks so much for watching this little documentary on The Last of Us Part 1. It was a lot of fun to put together. A massive shout out to Jeremy Jane for doing the initial edit on this, for Frank Howley for capturing all this gameplay, and for Jesse Garasha for just generally helping around here at NoClip. If you'd like to support us, if you like the work we do, please head over to patreon.com/NoClip and support us as much as you can. We're a totally independent team. We do this because we love it. And I don't know why I'm
Sentito ragazzi, quindi se avete modo di supportarli è una buona cosa da fare.
I never read them. We usually get them for B-roll, quite honestly. And then sometimes I'm tired after editing, and I just do this. I just go, that's a pretty picture. Somebody spent like 4 hours making that. I'm just gonna give it 3 seconds of my time. Look at that. Kind of like documentaries. I don't know how many hours we put into this one. Thanks to all the people on screen right now, all the folks who contribute to us, who are in the credits. They're pretty awesome. If you join us on Patreon, you get loads of stuff. You get bonus podcasts, you get videos. I'm back selling again. You get the warm cockles in your heart knowing that you're paying for the rent of everyone I just mentioned. And more documentaries. We're working on loads more at the moment. I wish I could tell you what they are, but I don't know when this is going up and what's under embargo. But a load of indie stuff. Some big games that came out last year, some small games that came out last year too.
Bello il documentario, sì. Vabbè, NoClip li fa sempre fare.
Thanks for watching. Bye.
Ok, penso che si possa chiudere adesso. Ok, abbiamo fatto tutta la carrellata, hanno rimandato al Patreon, quindi adesso credo proprio che si possa decidere di chiudere. Ok, allora gente... Ops, scusate, audio, sono un cretino io, ho smutato il canale sbagliato. Ok, ecco, bene, ora mi sentite, perfetto. Allora, stavo dicendo, non c'è moltissimo da dire, perché davvero il documentario ha detto tutto. È esattamente quello che ho provato io. Cioè, tutto quello che è stato detto in questo documentario è la valorizzazione di un progetto di ripresa di un gioco iconico che, a distanza di soli, tra virgolette, 10 anni, doveva ridare vita a qualcosa di importante. Ora, come vi ho detto, molti l'hanno ritenuta un'operazione commerciale pura e semplice, e sono in buona parte d'accordo con tutto questo, ma il mio sottovalutare tutto quello che sarebbe significato rigiocare quelle vicende con il comparto tecnico attuale, che praticamente ha saltato 2 generazioni rispetto al gioco originale, anche se vabbè si trattava della fine della generazione PS3, ecco, sottovalutandolo ho fatto un errore e mi sono ritrovato di fronte a qualcosa di molto sontuoso, decisamente sontuoso, che ha fatto davvero effetto. E mi sono riemozionato per certe cose che ho rivissuto, e il bello è che l'avevo vissuto, cioè The Last of Us è uno di quei giochi che sì, rigiochi perché magari ti piace troppo e anche certe cose le vuoi riesplorare e magari trovare qualcosa di nascosto eccetera, ma la vicenda è bella soltanto una volta da da vivere così, perché ti ricordi quali sono le vicende e che cosa succedono. Nonostante questo ha saputo cogliermi, quindi questo è il tributo a un gioco che è stato fatto veramente con i controcazzi, no? E quindi anche quando si tratta di fare remake è un'attenzione e una qualità che ha Naughty Dog e pochi altri studi, no? È davvero fighissimo. Quindi non c'è molto altro da dire, ragazzi. Spero tanto che continuino a lavorare così anche per la nuova IP, che a quanto pare sarà addirittura d'arrivo. Credo che arriverà prima di The Last of Us parte 3, e quindi da qui alla fine della generazione, se continua esattamente come hanno fatto con le altre generazioni, noi fra, quant'è? Un annetto? Forse 2? Vedremo la nuova IP di Naughty Dog, e poi a fine generazione 2027, paccato, almeno credo, avremo The Last of Us parte 3. Si spera.